Yo, what's good everyone? We just got the 5.4 livestream and they revealed Mizuki is the next 5-star going into the standard pool. Obviously this means we can all grab a free copy of her later in the year when anniversary rolls around, so let's look at the kit's builds and teams. I've seen a lot of people calling her a 5-star Sucrose because she's an animo catalyst with a little bit of crowd control. Honestly, I consider her to be more of a 5-star Sayu. In Razor language, when you use a skill, she enters a state where you can't normal attack and instead bump into enemies like Sayu. In this state, she's going to deal AoE animo damage to nearby enemies, which is similar but a bit better than Sayu. Her burst does 3 things. It pulls in enemies dealing animo damage, summons a magic pig thing that starts shitting out snacks. If your HP is above 70%, the snacks deal AoE animo damage. If your HP is below 70%, they heal you, just like Sayu. So basically, you pop a burst, use a skill, and float around picking up pig shit and throwing it at enemies. One thing I'll mention too is that a skill state increases the team's swirl damage. I'm not sure what Hoyo are cooking there because you'll need off-field elements to actually swirl. It's only triggered when she's on-field in a skill state, so you need an animo off-fielder. So are you trying to encourage us to use Kazuha, Sucrose or Venti as off-field swirl DPSs? Maybe some synergy with Lynette? Or is it intended to just be a restrictive way for Mizuki to buff herself without anyone else taking advantage of it? If you have an idea, drop it in the comments. For pros and cons, the biggest positive is that she's a standard unit, therefore we can obtain her completely free. Another positive is that she carries out so many roles as a healer, driver and crowd controller. This gives you more freedom to dedicate all the other slots in your team to off-field damage and supports. With her being able to hold VV, she'll enable your other teammates to deal more damage, which is always useful for drivers. It frees up your other animo units like Kazuha for the other side of the abyss too. Also, with her being a catalyst user, she can hold supportive weapons, which we'll touch on in a minute. She takes Inazuma talent books too, so if you have a bunch lying around, she'll be easy to build. Mizuki being a standard 5-star is a double-edged sword though. It means anyone pulling her in 5.4 is getting a unit with a power level of a standard 5-star for the price of a limited 5-star. Another big downside is that with her not normal attacking in a skill state, she's limited on who she can be run with. You can't make full use of Xingqiu, Yolan, Beidou or Fischl C6. Cryo off-fielders don't deal a lot of damage, so it restricts your team building options in a similar way to Chaska. We'll look at the team synergies in more detail once we get to that section of the video, but it's worth noting there's always potential for her to get more units in the future. With Mizuki's Constellations being a little more obtainable, with her being a standard unit, let's look at them. Her C1 marks enemies and then the mark is removed when she triggers Swirl. In exchange, the Swirl damage is buffed, scaling off her Elemental Mastery. She applies the mark every 3.5 seconds. Her C2 is probably the one you'll hope for when you're losing any 50-50s. For every point of Elemental Mastery she has, she increases the team's Pyro, Hydro, Cryo or Electro damage by 0.04%. So if she has 1000 Elemental Mastery, which is achievable given the fact she ascends with it, she gives the team a 40% buff of those elements. C3 is 3 extra levels on her skill, C5 is 3 extra levels on her burst, C4 removes the 70% cap on her skill, meaning you get both the extra instances of damage and healing instead of just one or the other. Finally, her C6 gives swirl damage the chance to crit with a fixed 30% crit rate and 100% crit damage. Side note, if you're interested in seeing the difference that each of these constellations make, subscribe to the channel. When she drops, I'll be releasing a video showing off each constellation all the way to C6. In terms of weapons, her signature will obviously be best. She's a swirl unit with healing scaling off her Elemental Mastery, so it has an Elemental Mastery secondary stat, even more Elemental Mastery after triggering swirl, even more after using a skill, and even more after a burst. By nature, this makes the weapon useful on other animo drivers like Sucrose and Hazo, and even an option for Seat Lally. For her other weapon options, Nahida's weapon gives her a lot of Elemental Mastery as well as a little bit for the team. Sacrificial Fragments is a nice Elemental Mastery stick too. Her Cushion Ring gives a little bit of energy recharge as well as 20% electro damage to the team, and 20% elemental damage for whichever element it reacts with. Wandering Even Star is an option too to give the team a little bit of attack. It won't be a lot, but may be worth it if you have high refinements. Her artifacts are easy, just use Viridescent Venera. As you know, it reduces the opponent's resistance to swirled elements, but also increases Mizuki's swirl damage. Go with Elemental Mastery on everything and Energy Recharge in the substats. If you find you're struggling with getting a burst regularly though, you can use Energy Recharge stands instead. Elemental Mastery is useful because it increases her swirl damage, any other reactions caused by her swirls, her healing, the extra swirl damage from her C1, and the elemental damage buff from her C2. Now for my favourite part of the video. Let's start cooking some delicious teams. Electrocharge got a buff in 5.2 as well as a new unit in Auroron. He can hold 4-piece scroll too, which is going to buff Electro and Hydro. Farina providing the off-field Hydro means you have a few options in the last slot. If you can get enough energy recharge on her, Lisa is going to be an option. Her burst reduces the opponent's defense, which doesn't increase swirl damage, but it will make Farina and Auroron deal more. Yaimiko's an option too, or you could go with Fischl, but you won't be able to make use of her C6. If you went for Siege Queen, she's going to be great for buffing your Farina too. If not, you could use Kokomi as an alternative for the Hydro Resonance. Even though Mizuki's an Anemo unit, you could play with Nahida. The two elements don't directly react with each other, but throwing in Electro and or Hydro gives you some options. You'd go with Farina as the Hydro option again because Mizuki can't trigger Yelan or Sing Cho's attacks. Auroron for Electro gives you Aggravate for Nahida and Auroron's damage, as well as enough Electro to trigger Hyper Bloom when there are Bloom Seeds. You won't generate as many Bloom Seeds as you do in regular Hyper Bloom teams though, so I wouldn't call this team meta. It's more of an experimental team that you'd run for fun. There's always the option to swap out Farina for more Electro too. Lisa, Yai or Fischl will work, and the Electro Resonance will help a unit like Lisa for generating more particles to cover her 80 burst cost. Nahida can hold Magic Guide, which is friendly towards free-to-play players, and her giving Mizuki a big elemental mastery buff's appreciated too. It's worth noting that Mizuki triggers Electro Swirls. With enemies having Quicken auras, she'll get some big damage aggravate procs off herself, just like Kazuha does in aggravate teams. Overloaded could be interesting with Mizuki. Usually you'd have to be careful because of a knockback and would typically only use it against heavier enemies. With Mizuki's grouping, she could still keep enemies in a range where they can be hit. Given the fact that Pyro has such strong off-fielders in Xiangling and Mawika as well as Bennett for support, I imagine it's worth giving a go. In terms of an Electro teammate, you've got Auroron who would help Mawika gain fighting spirit for a burst as well as holding scroll to buff her damage. The only issue is his burst has a relatively small range which could be an issue with knockback. Yaimiko's an option for damage, but I'm hoping Iansan can give us another option when she comes out. A more typical team using off-field Pyro will be this Vape team. Farina, Xiangling and Bennett are already a strong trio, so as long as your on-field unit isn't a complete detriment to the team, it will beat most content in the game. Fortunately, Mizuki doesn't ruin the team, and this will probably end up being one of the strongest. Freeze is an option for scenarios where you're up against a lot of smaller enemies, but the cryo off-fielders don't deal great damage. You might have some fun using a team like Farina, Kaya and Rosaria, especially with a lot of people just liking Kaya in general, but it won't be great in higher Abyss floors. That's not to say it won't be strong in Imaginarium Theatre though, especially with all the buffs you can trigger. Superconduct's in a similar situation. It got buffs in 5.2 and even though it's a support or two short of being meta, it could be useful in Imaginarium Theatre or lower Abyss floors. Superconduct scales off elemental mastery, so Mizuki triggering it will see some nice numbers. I'll be trying out Lisa, Kaya and Rosaria when Mizuki comes out. Maybe even Lynette in place of one of the cryo options. That way we get the Anemo Resonance and with it more movement speed, so Mizuki becomes Mizumi. I'll see myself out. Overall, I'd say Mizuki has potential to be a decent standard 5-star. The only thing missing is more off-field units for synergy with her not using normal attacks. There's been a lot of Doom posting surrounding the kit, but I'd dismiss most of it honestly. She isn't going to compete with limited 5-star on-fielders, so curb your expectations there. But she's one of the better standard 5-stars and can get even better with more units to synergize with in the future. I dropped a guide comparing the value of all the 5-stars for 5.4, and I'm going to drop some up-to-date videos on Wriothesley and Farina too. Subscribe to the channel if you're interested in them, and take it easy.